Welcome to Genesis Unleashed, where we unleash the truth of Genesis.
And ask the question, why don't we find millions of transitional fossils?
Welcome back to Genesis Unleashed, and again we're back with the Question Evolution Flyer, 15 questions for evolutionists. We're tackling question 9.
Right.
And here is the question. Why are the expected countless millions of transitional fossils missing? Here's the detail on the question. Darwin noted the problem, and it still remains. The evolutionary family trees in textbooks are based on imagination, not fossil evidence. Famous Harvard paleontologist and evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould wrote, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. Other evolutionist fossil experts also admit the problem." So that's the question with the detail. And for those other evolutionists, have a look at creation.com/patquote. Right. And you can see an article there done by Gary Bates with our U.S. office on a quote from Colin Patterson.
From the late Dr. Colin Patterson.
That's right, yeah.
And at the time, he was the senior paleontologist. So he's the fossil expert at the prestigious British Museum of Natural History. So this was no slouch. He's an evolutionist, and he made a very damning, I guess we could say, quote about the fossil record and transitional fossils, because he'd written a book about evolution and about fossils. And so he got a letter to someone who asked him why he didn't include pictures of all the different transitional fossils in his new fossil book. And here was the quote.
Sense.
Yeah, well, why wouldn't you, right? If it's true. And here's what Patterson said. "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? Yet Gould and the American Museum are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. You say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There's not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." Now that's from a leading evolutionary fossil expert. Of course, he's quoting Gould. And Gould and Eldridge, as evolutionists, as atheists, not wanting to believe in God, Gould said, yeah, there's the lack of transitional fossils are a problem, so much so that he came up with a new concept of evolution.
To try to get around the idea of what he was observing in the fossil record as a paleontologist, that there aren't any transitional fossils.
Right.
So he attempted another punctuated equilibrium and so on.
Yeah, that's right. So here's some, we did receive some answers to this question, and we're going to go through them. So here's answer number 1. They aren't missing. Every fossil ever found is a link between older and newer forms.
Okay, that's not been demonstrated. It's just assumed.
Right.
It also doesn't work numerically. If the majority of fossils, the majority of fossils that we find do fit very neatly into predefined groups.
Right.
And so if they were all in transition, how would you be able to define groups? And when a new fossil type is found, it fits neatly into a particular group.
Right.
The handfuls of fossils that are claimed to be transitional today, they were recognized by Darwin many years ago as a problem at that point.
Right. Now, the thing is, there's a handful today. There was a handful back then, but the handful today isn't the same as the handful back then.
Right.
And when we say there's only a handful of disputed transitional fossils, that means they're disputed within the evolutionary community themselves. I mean, you know, many people would remember coelacanth as a supposed transition between, you know, fish and tetrapods, right? It's the fish that was on its way to crawling out of the water and stuff like that. Well, now that's been totally thrown out. As a matter of fact, they used to think it was, you know, alive 60 million years ago because of the fossil record. Now they know they found live ones, so that's gone off the radar. But that's the problem, is it's always changing, right? It's not like they've proven this one or proven that one. They're always in dispute.
Yes.
So if you'd like more information on those disputed fossils, you can go to this link, this article called "Famous Living Fossil Link Idea Fizzles Further," and you can get that at creation.com. Fizzles.
Say that 10 times fast.
Okay, so there's only a handful of these fossils.
Today there's only a handful. There was only ever a handful. It was a problem in Darwin's time. It's just as much of a problem today. Actually, the next question in the Question Evolution Flyer, question 10, is going to deal specifically with living fossils. Right. Because a lot of those fossils, of course, that we find are identical to their living counterparts today.
Right.
All right, another answer came in. Only a small fraction of animals are fossilized. The fossil record still remains largely incomplete. That was an answer to this question, where are the transitional fossils?
Well, that was Darwin's answer many years ago. How come we don't, and he even said it, this is one of the biggest problems to my theory. We don't find the transitional forms. And so that might have flown back in Darwin's day, or like when Sir Richard Owen or Louis Agassiz or Adam Sedgwick, they didn't buy that, by the way. They thought they'd seen enough fossil evidence even at that time to challenge Darwin. But today, we're in a different boat, okay? By the way, if you want more information on those challenges even back then that Darwin had, you can look up an article on creation.com called Holy War and look into that further. But let's look at the evidence we do have today, okay? We'll put it up there for you. Fossilized representatives of every living animal phylum and every plant division. We have those today. There are many phyla that have fossilized representatives of every living group or class. 97.7% of living orders of land vertebrates are represented as fossils. 79.1% of living families of land vertebrates, at 87.8% if birds are excluded, as they are less likely to become fossilized. We have these today. We have a massive amount of fossil evidence to compare versus Darwin's day. And guess what? We're not seeing evidence of these so-called transitional forms that are just plain for everyone to see, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we can't really cite the incompleteness of the fossil record as a good excuse anymore for not finding transitional forms.
Yeah. So go to creation.com and you'll see an article called Refuting. It's Refuting CH3, and you can get an article on the fact that we don't see those.
And that's actually chapter 3 of Refuting Evolution.
Yep.
You can read that book. You don't have to buy it. You can read it for free online at that link.
Right.
And there's a whole chapter on the missing links really are missing. With so many forms accounted for, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of room for transitional fossils to do the work that they're supposed to do. This linkage between these different groups. We recognize that when we recognize that fossil events are rare.
Right.
That we can. I mean, they're rare certainly in processes happening today. Today, animals die, they decompose, they get scavenged by other animals, and so on. Fossilization is a rare process. Right. And then when you realize that what it takes to make a fossil really is rapid burial.
Right.
And then add to that, well, the Bible talks about a global flood, which would have rapidly buried plants and animals all over the world.
Right.
You know what? The fossil record fits beautifully with the Bible.
Right.
It doesn't fit with this slow and gradual, this uniformitarianism, this what you see operating now in sedimentation and mountain building and so on, that's always gone on into the past. What makes more sense is that there was a flood that produced the fossil record.
Darwin, because of his uniformitarian ideas, the idea that sedimentation took place at a very slow rate, and so you're going to make the fossil over millions of years, or at least eons of time. He said things like, "No organism wholly soft can be preserved," and yet today we see.
That's what he said.
Yeah, we see hundreds of jellyfish preserved in the fossil record. So obviously they got buried incredibly quickly. To even create a fossil like that, which is, again, great evidence for what the Bible says. There was rapid deposition at the time of the flood, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, we've got some more answers.
Another answer, number 3, they aren't missing. There are millions of transitional forms. So that was another response.
This is a little bizarre when the different answers that come in completely contradict themselves. I mean, if you remember answer number 2, well, the fossil record is largely incomplete. And then answer number 1 and 3, well, there's lots of transitional fossils. I mean, what is it? Are these transitional forms just commonplace? They're just all over the place where everybody can see them? Or are they rare because of rarity of fossilization events? You can't have it both ways.
Again, we just talked about this more or less. This answer would require virtually every fossil to be a transitional fossil. There's about 250,000 known fossil species discovered today.
Right.
And, but many fossils are practically identical to living creatures that we see anyway, so they wouldn't qualify as transitional to begin with. But anyways, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Answer number 4 was this. Tiktaalik is a good example of a transitional link. Okay, so you'll have to look up what a tiktaalik is to understand.
Well, we've got some web links here, but you know, a tiktaalik is an example of a well-designed fish. That's what it is. And for more details, you can go to creation.com/tiktaalik.
Right, but people might be sitting there going, wait a sec, I heard Richard Dawkins, I read his book, or I saw him on an interview, or I'm talking to this evolutionist.
No, he really promoted that one, didn't he?
Oh yeah, it was like, this is it. This is it. The creationists can just go home because, you know, Tiktaalik, this is it.
Now, as far as Tiktaalik is concerned, there's footprint fossil evidence from older than Tiktaalik, which throws it out of the lineage, something coming from the sea up onto land, because there's already been footprints fossilized before Tiktaalik.
Right. Now, that was at the time Tiktaalik was first really promoted. They hadn't discovered those footprints. So Tiktaalik was supposed to be the one that first started walking around, and it was found in a certain rock layer according to the evolutionary timescale at a certain age. But now they've found footprints beneath that, which means there was something else walking around before Tiktaalik even arrived on the scene, which means you have to now throw that out as the transitional form. And this is what we've been saying. The handful of transitional forms that Darwin was, you know, trying to promote were different from the ones today, which now Tiktaalik comes along. Now it gets knocked off the...
It's different from the one last week.
Exactly.
Or an hour ago.
Whatever the flavor of the week is.
For details, you can go to creation.com/tetrapod footprints.
Right.
Tetrapod footprints.
Answer number 5. Evolution would stand even if we didn't have a single fossil. That was the answer to why there's no transitional fossils.
Well, not all evolutionists would agree.
Right.
For example, the French zoologist Pierre-Paul Grasset, he was the editor of a 35-volume, in French it was Traité de zoologie. I'm not sure if my accent's correct there, but here's what he said. Naturalists must remember that the process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. A knowledge of paleontology is therefore a prerequisite. Only paleontology can provide them with the evidence of evolution and reveal its course or mechanisms. That is why we must constantly have recourse to paleontology, the only true science of evolution. From it, we learn how to interpret the present occurrences cautiously. It reveals that certain hypotheses considered certainties by their authors are in fact questionable or even illegitimate.
Listen, critics would say this to creationists. Listen, you know, evolution's true whether we got fossils, whether we don't got fossils. You know, natural selection, you know, it's by chance. But wait, no, it's not by chance. I mean, you're hearing this back and forth thing all the time. If your explanation, if your theory can explain any bit of evidence, you can just take any bit of evidence and just throw it in. Yeah, it fits our theory, one way and or another. That's not really rigid science, is it?
You can't falsify it that way.
No.
If there's no amount of evidence that can convince you that evolution isn't true, then it's not a really good scientific theory. And yet evolution, it's not a scientific theory. Neither is creation, by the way.
That's right.
But evolutionists push evolution as science.
It's fact, it's sound science.
That's right. They're both stories about the past. Creation, evolution, they're both stories of the past held to by faith. Now we look at things in the present and see which one is supported, which history is supported, held to by faith, by the things that we observe today. For more on the topic, quite an interesting topic on the discussion of how science relates to beliefs about the past and so on, you can go to creation.com/self-serving. Quite an interesting discussion there, creation.com/self-serving.
Yeah. Encourage people to keep reading the 15 questions. You can get all of them online, creation.com, 15 questions, and we're going to continue this series to go through them and see if there's any good answers.
Welcome back to Genesis Unleashed, and again we're back with the Question Evolution Flyer, 15 questions for evolutionists. We're tackling question 9.
Right.
And here is the question. Why are the expected countless millions of transitional fossils missing? Here's the detail on the question. Darwin noted the problem, and it still remains. The evolutionary family trees in textbooks are based on imagination.
Fossils in his new fossil book. And here was the
Makes
quote.
sense.
Yeah, well, why wouldn't you, right? If it's true. And here's what Patterson said. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? Yet Gould and the American Museum are hard to...
On a quote from Colin Patterson.
From the late Dr. Colin Patterson.
That's right, yeah.
And at the time, he was the senior paleontologist, so he's the fossil expert at the prestigious British Museum of Natural History, so this was no slouch. He's an evolutionist, and he made a very damning, I guess we could say, quote about the fossil record and transitional fossils, because he'd written a book about evolution and about fossils. And so he got a letter to someone who asked him why he didn't include pictures of all the different transitional...
Welcome to Genesis Unleashed, where we unleash the truth of Genesis.
And ask the question, why don't we find millions of transitional fossils?
Not fossil evidence. Famous Harvard paleontologist and evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould wrote, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. Other evolutionist fossil experts also admit the problem." So that's the question with the detail. And for those other evolutionists, have a look at creation.com/patquote. Right. And you can see an article there done by Gary Bates with our U.S. office.